The king's library had not been cleaned in 11 years, and I was the third maid assigned to try. The first had lasted 9 days. She reported that the East Gallery smelled of rotten paper and that something moved behind the shelves at night, shifting, settling sounds that came from everywhere and nowhere, as though the room itself objected to being entered. She was reassigned to the guest chambers without argument. The second lasted 4 days. She emerged on the 5th morning, pale-faced and tight-lipped, and told the head of household that she would rather scrub the waste processors in the sub-basement than set foot in the East Wing again. She did not explain. Nobody pressed her. The supplementary assignment was logged as non-completable, and the library continued its slow, private collapse behind a sealed door. I arrived at the Atherin Royal Citadel on a wet morning in late autumn, carrying a canvas bag with 2 changes of clothes, a set of cleaning tools I had assembled over 14 years of service across 6 postings, and no particular expectations about what I would find. My name is Bryn Calloway. I was 41 years old, human, and I had spent the better part of 2 decades cleaning things that other people did not want to clean. Frontier outposts with air recyclers clogged by alien dust that smelled like iron and burned sugar. Diplomatic residences where the previous tenants had left behind chemical stains that required neutralizing agents I mixed from supply closet basics. A children's hospital on Tessara Minor where the floors needed to be stripped and resealed every 72 hours because the antifungal coating could not survive the humidity, and the children could not survive the fungus. Each posting taught me something. None of them promoted me, because the kind of work I did was the kind that became visible only when it stopped being done. The head of household was a Thyran woman named Overseer Velsha, 7 feet tall, pale lavender skin, luminous silver eyes that tracked everything in a room with the efficiency of a surveillance grid. Her white hair was braided in the severe administrative style, pulled tight against her angular skull, and fastened with crystal pins that caught the corridor light like small, frozen stars. She walked me through the Citadel's service wing at a pace that assumed I could keep up and did not adjust when I stumbled on the polished steps. "The East Wing Library is a secondary assignment," she said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone delivering information she did not want questioned. "Your primary duties are the West Wing residential corridors. Standard cleaning rotation, daily surface maintenance, weekly deep clean, bi-weekly fabric treatment. You will be evaluated on the primary assignment. The library is supplementary." "What's wrong with the library?" Velsha's silver eyes slid sideways. The look contained an assessment I had seen many times before, the calculation of how much truth a new employee could handle without bolting. "King Ethereal does not use the East Wing Library. It has been closed to regular access for 11 years. Periodic cleaning attempts have been discontinued. Your assignment is to restore it to functional condition and maintain it on a weekly rotation." "Why was it closed?" The look hardened into something that did not invite further questions. "The king's consort died. The library was her personal study. He sealed it. It has not been opened regularly since." She handed me a crystal access key, a thin, luminous shard the size of my index finger, and turned away before I could ask anything else, which told me, more clearly than any verbal answer, that she either did not know the rest or considered the rest above my station to hear. I found the library on my second day, after finishing the morning rotation in the West Wing. The East Wing corridor was wide, high-ceilinged and empty Thyran architecture at its most imposing, crystal-veined marble walls, ambient light panels set into alcoves that cast a steady, cool blue glow, and floors so polished that my reflection walked beneath me like a second person keeping pace. But the polish ended halfway down the corridor. Past a certain unmarked line, the floor was dusty. The ambient panels flickered at irregular intervals. One had gone dark entirely, leaving a stretch of shadow that felt deliberate, as if the building itself had decided this section was no longer worth illuminating. The library door was heavy, carved crystalline wood inlaid with silver filigree that had tarnished to black along every joint and edge. The access key hummed when I pressed it to the lock plate. The door swung inward with a sound like a held breath finally releasing. The smell came first. Not rot, I had been told rotten paper, and that was wrong. It was the smell of stillness, of air that had not circulated in over a decade. Paper and old binding, adhesive, and the faint mineral scent of thiron crystal dust settling on every surface like a slow, silent snowfall that nobody had been present to witness. But underneath all of it was something else, the particular smell of a room that someone had loved and that had been left behind, which is different from a room that was never used at all. A room that was never used smells empty. A room that was loved and then abandoned smells like grief has a chemical signature. And after 20 years of entering rooms in the aftermath of loss, I believe it does. The library was vast. 3 levels, connected by spiral walkways of translucent crystal that wound upward through a central atrium to a domed skylight high above. The shelves rose floor to ceiling on every level, thousands of volumes bound in thiron crystal cloth, their spines glowing faintly with the residual energy of preservation fields that had been failing, book by book, for 11 years. Some spines still glowed a steady pale blue. Others flickered like dying candles. Others had gone entirely dark, and those books showed the first signs of degradation, crystal cloth curling at the edges, binding adhesive crystallizing into brittle sand that fell in tiny drifts to the shelf below. Light came from the domed skylight at the atrium's apex, real light, filtered through layers of crystal that transmuted it into something between sunlight and moonlight, neither warm nor cold but luminous. It fell in a single column through the center of the space, illuminating a reading alcove on the ground floor, a low table, a curved seat upholstered in fabric that had once been deep blue and was now faded to the pale gray of things long untouched, and a book left open on the table's surface. The book's pages had yellowed at the edges. A pressed flower, thin, translucent, silver-veined, lay between them, perfectly preserved by the dry air and the last whisper of a failing preservation field. I stood in the doorway for a long time, not because I was frightened. I understood immediately why the previous cleaners had left. They had walked into this room expecting dirt and disorder, the straightforward kind of mess that yields to effort and chemicals. What they had found was something else entirely: grief. And grief is not something you can sweep away. It is not something that responds to solvents or scrubbing or scheduled maintenance rotations. It sits in a room the way water sits in stone, deep, invisible, altering everything it touches without appearing to move. The first cleaner had heard things moving behind the shelves at night. I knew what that was. In old rooms with crystal-veined marble walls and failing climate control, the stone itself expands and contracts with temperature shifts, producing sounds that range from soft clicks to low groans depending on the mineral composition. It is the building breathing. If you do not know what it is, it sounds like something alive hiding in the walls. If you do know what it is, it sounds like a building that is tired and cold and has been left alone too long. But I was not here to fix grief, and I was not here to comfort a building. I was here to clean a room, and I had cleaned rooms with grief in them before, enough to know that the only way through them is to pick up your cloth and your bucket and begin, surface by surface, without pretending that what you are touching is only dust. I set down my bag, rolled up my sleeves, and started with the floor. It took me 3 weeks to complete the initial cleaning. Not because the work was technically difficult. I had handled worse conditions in worse settings with fewer supplies, but because the library resisted cleaning the way a wound resists being touched. Every surface I wiped revealed something personal beneath the dust. A handwritten note tucked between volumes on the second level, the ink faded to near invisibility. A line of thiron poetry in careful, deliberate script that I could not read but whose handwriting spoke of someone who wrote slowly and meant every word she set down. A pair of reading lenses in a crystal case on the third level, sized for Thyran features, delicate, silver-framed, with a small crack in the left lens that had been repaired with a bead of clear adhesive so fine it was nearly invisible. Someone had loved these lenses enough to mend them rather than replace them, even though the crystal case they rested in was lined with velvet that suggested the wearer could have afforded 100 replacements. A shallow dish on a corner shelf of the second level, holding 3 small stones polished smooth by water, each a different shade of gray, river stones, collected and carried here and placed on a shelf where they could be seen from the reading chair below. Nobody collects river stones unless the river meant something. A shawl draped over the back of the reading seat in the alcove. Thyran silk, once deep violet, now faded and mapped with dust in patterns that traced the contours of the fabric's folds, the same folds it had been resting in for 11 years undisturbed. I lifted it to clean the seat beneath, and the fabric released a scent, faint, barely there, but unmistakable, something floral and warm like heated stone after rain. The consort's scent. 11 years dead, and her shawl still carried her. I folded the shawl carefully and placed it on the table beside the open book. I did not move either item. That was the first rule I made for myself. Clean around the personal items. Never displace them. This was not my room. I was not here to rearrange a dead woman's life. I was here to make the space livable again without erasing the person who had lived in it. The work itself was painstaking. I cleaned the 3 levels in sequence, starting from the top and working down, standard practice for dust removal, since gravity carries particles downward and you clean in the direction they travel. The 3rd level was the worst. Exposure to the skylight had accelerated the crystal dust accumulation, and the shelves were coated in a mineral film so thick it had turned the crystal walkway opaque. I used a dry microfiber cloth for the initial pass, no liquid, because liquid on crystal dust creates a paste that bonds permanently to Thyran marble, and then followed with a damp cloth wrung nearly dry, working in small sections, buffing each surface until the crystal beneath showed through like ice clearing from a window. The book spines required individual treatment. Of the 973 volumes in the library, 642 had failing or failed preservation fields. The ones still flickering could be left alone. Their degradation was slow enough that the remaining field would hold them for years. But the fully dark ones needed immediate stabilization, or the crystal cloth binding would continue to crystallize until the books literally fell apart at the touch. I formulated a preservation paste from supply closet ingredients, a binding polymer used for floor sealant, specifically the variant manufactured for high-traffic crystal marble surfaces, which I had used in every posting because it was cheap and effective, and nobody ever ran out of it, diluted to 1/10 strength with distilled water. The dilution was critical. Full strength would have sealed the book's spines permanently, trapping moisture inside the binding and accelerating the very decay I was trying to prevent. 1/10 strength created a thin, breathable film that held the crystal cloth fibers together without sealing them. I had used the same formula at the Children's Hospital on Tessara Minor to stabilize degrading wall panels in the pediatric ward. It was not archival-grade preservation. It was a Maid's improvisation, but it worked. I treated each of the 642 books individually, removing it from the shelf, cleaning the spine with a dry brush, applying the paste with a soft cloth in single directional strokes, and returning the book to the exact position from which it had been taken. I used a numbered grid drawn on a cloth to track each book's position, because a library is a map of someone's mind, and rearranging it is the same as rearranging their thoughts. I repaired 4 light panels using maintenance parts I requisitioned from the sub-basement stores. The request form listed East Wing Corridor, supplementary maintenance, and nobody questioned it because nobody tracked supplementary assignments, and nobody cared what happened in the East Wing. The panels cast their cool blue glow across the shelves again, filling the spaces between the skylight's central column with a steady, even illumination that turned the library from a cave into a room. By the end of the third week, the library was clean. The floors gleamed crystal-veined marble that, once freed of its mineral dust, reflected the skylight in rippling columns of pearl and blue. The spiral walkways were transparent again. The treated book spines stood in neat rows, their surfaces stable, no longer shedding fine crystal sand at the slightest vibration. And the personal items remained exactly where I had found them. The open book with its pressed flower, the reading lenses in their cracked case, the river stones in their dish. The violet shawl folded on the table. I had dusted around them, cleaned beneath them when I could lift them gently, and returned every one to its precise position. The library looked, for the first time in 11 years, like a place where someone might actually sit down and read. I did not expect anyone to notice. 20 years of cleaning had thoroughly cured me of that expectation. The library was done. It was clean, stable, and maintained. The fact that it was also sacred, that every surface I had touched carried the weight of a woman's life and a man's grief, was not in the cleaning log and never would be. I filed my supplementary maintenance report through the East Wing administrative channel. 6 pages of materials used, time allocated, structural conditions observed, and recommendations for ongoing preservation. I noted the failing preservation fields and recommended a professional archivist be contracted for the remaining 331 volumes whose fields still flickered, but would eventually fail. I noted the climate control calibration. I noted the 4 repaired light panels and the 2 additional ones that needed replacement parts not available in sub-basement stores. I attached the formulation for the stabilization paste, in case a future cleaner needed to reapply it. The report entered the Citadel's administrative system and was marked as received. Nobody replied. Nobody followed up. This was not unusual. In 14 years of filing supplementary reports, I had received exactly 1 reply, a form acknowledgement from a facilities manager on Darren's World who had misspelled my name. I returned to the library the following week for my first scheduled maintenance visit. The work would be lighter now: dust management, spot treatment of any newly degraded spines, climate checks, a full floor polish once a month. An hour and a half, maybe 2. Routine, the kind of work that, in the absence of catastrophe, is perfectly invisible. On the 23rd day, I arrived at the library for my weekly maintenance rotation and found that someone had been there. The reading seat in the alcove had been used. The dust pattern was disturbed, not by a cleaning tool, but by a body. Someone had sat in the seat for what appeared to be a considerable time. The shawl had been moved from the table to the armrest, as if the sitter had picked it up and held it and then carefully set it aside. The open book had been shifted, not closed, not turned to a new page, but angled slightly, the way a book moves when someone leans over it to read the exposed lines without touching the yellowed pages. I cleaned around the disturbance and left everything as I found it. The following week, the same. Someone had sat in the alcove. This time, a second book had been pulled from the shelf, a slim volume with a dark crystal cloth cover, and placed on the table beside the first. It was open to a page near the middle, and a thin Thyron light marker had been laid at the spine, the kind of luminous bookmark I had seen in the Citadel's administrative offices. The marker was new. Its preservation field was fully charged, glowing a steady soft white against the aged pages. Someone was reading in this room again. In a space that had been sealed for 11 years, someone had come back. I did not ask who, I knew. There was only one person in the Citadel with an access key to this room, and only one person for whom the shawl would carry meaning. I adjusted my routine. I began arriving earlier, completing my West Wing work at a faster pace, ensuring the library was always clean before the reader returned. I repaired 2 more light panels, the ones directly above the alcove, so the reading light would be consistent and kind to aging eyes. I noticed that the reader preferred the seat angled slightly toward the skylight's central column, so I adjusted the seat's position by 2 inches and polished the section of floor beneath its legs so it would not scrape against the marble when moved. I treated the shelf nearest the alcove with particular care, because that was where the reader was pulling new volumes, and several of those books had failing preservation fields that would crumble at a rough touch. Small adjustments, invisible ones, the kind of work that exists in the gap between what a space needs and what anyone thinks to ask for. The third-level walkway railing near the descending curve had a loose crystal bolt. I tightened it with a standard multi-tool from my kit. The ambient temperature in the library ran 2 degrees colder than the rest of the east wing, because the climate control for this section had been set to preservation mode when the room was sealed, a mode designed for empty rooms, not occupied ones. I adjusted it upward, just enough that a person sitting for an hour would not grow uncomfortable. Nobody noticed. Nobody was supposed to notice. During the 4th week, I found a new sign. A cup, not a Thyran ceremonial vessel but a plain ceramic mug, the kind used in the Citadel's staff kitchens, had been left on the side table beside the reading seat. It was empty, but the faint ring of residue at the bottom told me it had held vrethais, the warm herbal drink that Thyran consumed the way humans consume tea. Someone had sat in this library, drinking vrethais and reading, in a room they had not entered in 11 years. The mug had not been washed. It sat on the side table with the quiet confidence of an object left by someone who intended to return. I cleaned around it. I cleaned the table's surface up to the mug's base and not beneath it. I left it exactly where it was. The following week, the mug was gone, taken, presumably, by the same person who had brought it. In its place was a small cushion, dark blue, placed on the reading seat atop the shawl, a comfort item. The reader was settling in. I began to notice other things. Faint scuff marks on the floor near the perimeter shelves, someone walking the aisles, browsing, pulling volumes and replacing them. A book on the 3rd level had been moved to the 2nd, placed on a shelf beside a volume of similar binding, reorganized, not randomly displaced, but deliberately relocated by someone who understood the collection's logic and was adjusting it. The consort's organizational system was being gently, respectfully updated by the person who had known it best. The library was waking up, not all at once, not with any announcement, but the way all real things wake, one small movement at a time, each one evidence that the sleeper is still alive. I found on the shelf nearest the alcove a new book I had not seen before. It was not from the library's existing collection. The binding was different, newer, a deep midnight blue that had not faded. I pulled it gently and opened the cover. The title page was in formal Thyran script, which I could not read, but the dedication page contained 2 words that I recognized because they appeared on the memorial plaque I passed every morning in the West Wing corridor. Syrine's name. Someone had brought a new book into this room, a book dedicated to the consort, or perhaps written by her, or about her, and placed it on the shelf beside the volume she had collected herself. Not a replacement, an addition. The collection was growing again. I returned the book to its exact position and continued my work. The library was no longer a shrine. It was becoming, slowly and without any single decisive moment, what it had been before, a library, a living one, tended, used, evolving, still carrying the memory of the woman who had made it her own but no longer trapped in that memory, held by it instead. 5 weeks after I began cleaning the library, I met the king. I was on the 2nd level, treating a shelf of crystal cloth volumes whose binding adhesive had crystallized into a substance resembling fine golden sand. The work required patience, each book lifted, spine brushed clean, adhesive residue removed with a solvent I had formulated from 3 cleaning supplies combined in proportions I had worked out through trial and error over 2 postings, and the treated spine returned to the shelf in the exact position from which it had been taken. I was 40 minutes into the row, standing on a low step with a brush in one hand and a bottle of solvent in the other, when I heard someone on the floor below. The library was silent by nature. 3 levels of crystal and stone absorbed sound the way deep water absorbs light. But the alcove was directly below me, and the spiral walkway acted as an acoustic funnel, carrying small sounds upward with startling clarity. The creak of the reading seat, the soft rustle of a page turning, and then, very quietly, a breath that caught. The sound a person makes when they encounter something unexpected and are trying to absorb it without being heard. I looked down through the crystal walkway. The figure in the alcove was tall, 7 feet or more, with pale ice blue skin and white hair that fell loose past his shoulders in a style I had not seen among the Citadel's staff, who wore their hair braided or cropped in the service tradition. He wore a simple dark robe, unadorned, the kind of garment that could belong to a scholar or a servant or a man who had dressed without thinking, because his mind was already in the room he was walking toward. He was seated in the reading chair, leaning forward, his long-fingered hands resting on the edges of the open book. He was not reading, he was looking at the shawl. I watched him lift it from the armrest slowly, with the particular care of someone handling something that might dissolve at the touch. He brought it to his face. He held it there for a long time, long enough that I had to look away, because what I was seeing was not mine to see, the raw, unprotected moment of a man pressing his face into the last physical trace of someone he loved. When I looked back, the shawl was on his lap, his hands folded over it, and he was staring at the column of skylight with an expression I had learned to recognize across 20 years of entering rooms that belonged to people who were grieving. It was the expression of someone who had sealed a door because opening it hurt too much, and who had just discovered that someone else had made the room behind it bearable to enter again, not by forcing the door, but by cleaning what was on the other side of it. I went back to my shelf. I finished the row in silence, packed my tools, and descended the walkway to the ground floor. I intended to leave without passing through the alcove. I took the long way around the perimeter shelves, staying close to the wall, my footsteps softened by 20 years of professional habit. Cleaning had taught me to move through occupied rooms as though I were made of the same air the room was breathing. I was 3 steps from the door when his voice stopped me. "You cleaned this room." I turned. He was standing, the shawl folded over one arm, his silver-white eyes fixed on me with an intensity I had never had directed at me by anyone in a position of authority. Thyron eyes were always luminous. Their biology made it standard, but his carried something behind the luminescence, a focused depth of attention that felt like standing in a beam of light you could not step out of and did not want to. "Yes, sir." The preservation paste on the book spines. That is not a standard archival treatment. "No, sir. I formulated it from floor sealant, diluted to 1/10 concentration with distilled water. It is not archival grade, but it arrests the crystal cloth degradation and allows the spines to be handled without further damage." He was quiet for a moment, his ice-blue features angular, sharp-boned, with the kind of sculpted symmetry that Thyron aristocracy cultivated through centuries of selective pairing, showed nothing I could easily read. Then something shifted, a hairline fracture in the composure, running through a wall that had been standing for a very long time. "You did not move the book." "No, sir." "You did not close it. You did not remove the flower." "No, sir. Those items are not mine to move." He looked at me then, truly looked, the full and undivided attention of a person who had not truly looked at another person in a very long time, brought to bear on a 41-year-old human woman in a maid's uniform holding a bottle of improvised book sealant and a cleaning brush. "You cleaned around her." It was not a question, but I answered it anyway. "Yes, sir, it is her room. I am only maintaining it." He held the shawl against his chest. One hand pressed flat over the faded violet fabric, the gesture unconscious and exposed and so deeply private that I felt I should not be seeing it. The same feeling I had had on the walkway above, looking down. But he was looking at me while he did it, which meant he was choosing to be seen while he held the last of her. And I understood that the choice itself was the point. "What is your name?" "Bryn Calloway, sir. Cleaning staff, West Wing Residential, East Wing Library Supplementary." "How long have you been maintaining this room?" 5 weeks, sir. 3 weeks for the initial restoration, 2 weeks of weekly maintenance since. In 5 weeks, you have done what 2 previous cleaners could not accomplish in a combined 13 days. They were not given adequate context, sir. They were told the room was closed and difficult. They were not told why. Without the why, they could not read the room. When you do not understand what a space is holding, you cannot know how to touch it. If I had been told only what they were told, I might have left too. The fracture widened. Something behind the composure moved, not collapse, not tears, but a slow, tectonic shift. The kind of movement that happens deep in a structure when a weight carried for a very long time finds an unexpected point of support. "Who told you why?" "Overseer Velsha mentioned that your consort died and that the library was her personal study. That was all she said. It was enough. That was enough to make you clean around a dead woman's belongings for 3 weeks without anyone asking you to. It was enough to make me understand that the room was not abandoned, sir. It was mourned. Those are different conditions. An abandoned room needs clearing. A mourned room needs tending. The approach is entirely different." He sat down slowly in the reading chair, as if his legs had made the decision for him. The shawl was still pressed to his chest. His luminous eyes had not left my face, and I realized, with the quiet certainty that comes from years of entering private spaces, that he was not looking at me the way a king looks at a servant. He was looking at me the way a person in a dark room looks at the first light that does not hurt their eyes. 11 years, he said. His voice had changed, lower, rougher, stripped of the composed distance that had armored his first words. "I sealed this room 11 years ago because I could not be inside it without her. Every surface reminded me, every book she had touched. The way the light fell on the chair where she read in the evenings with her knees drawn up and her hair spilling over the armrest like water. The smell of this fabric," he lifted the shawl slightly, "was the last thing that was still hers that I could reach, and every time I entered this room the scent grew fainter, and the fading was worse than the grief, because grief is at least the presence of what you have lost, but the scent disappearing, that was the losing itself. Happening again, happening still, one molecule at a time, and I could not stop it." I said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that grief does not need responses, it needs witnesses. Every advisor I have, every court physician, every counselor the household arranged, they all said the same thing in their own carefully chosen words: process the loss, release the attachment, allow the space to be repurposed. His voice carried the particular bitterness of someone who has been told repeatedly that the most important thing in their life should be made useful. They wanted me to empty her shelves, donate her books, give the room a new function, a meeting chamber, a secondary audience hall, something efficient. Something that served a purpose they could measure. He looked at the open book on the table, at the pressed flower between its yellowed pages. They did not understand that this room is not a room. It is the last place in this citadel where Serene still exists. Her handwriting is in the margins. Her reading lenses sit on the shelf where she left them the morning she died. The flower between those pages is from the garden where I proposed to her, pressed the night she said yes. If I emptied this room, she would be gone, truly gone. Not dead, I have survived dead for 11 years and I have learned to carry it. Gone. The erasure of every physical trace that she was here, and I could not survive that. The skylight cast its column of filtered light across the alcove. Dust motes drifted through it, fewer now than before I had cleaned, but still present, still catching the light like small, patient constellations of the ordinary. So I sealed it, and I told myself that sealing it was preservation, but sealing it was not preservation, it was paralysis. The room decayed because I was too afraid to touch it. The books degraded because I could not enter to maintain them. The preservation fields failed because maintenance requires presence, and presence in this room required facing something I could not face, that she is not here, that she will never be here, that the room will never again contain the person who made it a room instead of a collection of shelves and pages. He paused. His voice had gone rough at the edges, the way stone goes rough when water has worn a deep channel through it. Her room, the room she loved, the room where she was most herself, was dying by inches while I stood on the other side of a locked door and called it respect. He looked at the pressed flower, then at the shawl in his hands, then at me. You entered this room and you did not try to fix me. You did not counsel me. You did not suggest I move forward or process or repurpose. You cleaned it. You maintained it. You treated her belongings with care and left them where they were. You made the room survivable. And 3 weeks ago I walked in for the first time in 11 years, and I could breathe in this room without feeling that the air itself was an accusation. I stood by the door with my bottle and my brush, and I did the only thing I knew how to do in the presence of another person's unguarded pain, which was to be present without intruding. That was not your assignment, he said. My assignment was to restore the room to functional condition, sir. I interpreted that to include respecting what was already in it. You interpreted it, the ghost of something, not a smile, not yet, but the cleared ground where a smile might eventually take root, passed across his ice-blue features. You interpreted a cleaning assignment as an act of care. Cleaning is an act of care, sir. It always has been. Most people do not notice because the care is directed at spaces rather than at persons. But the spaces hold the persons. If you tend the space with attention, you tend everyone who has ever lived in it. That is not interpretation. It is the job. He was quiet for a long time. The skylight shifted as the planet turned, and the column of light crawled slowly across the floor, painting a gentle arc across the marble. The dust motes turned in it like small worlds in orbit around a source of light that asked nothing of them. Then he said, "Before you leave today, would you do one thing for me?" "What is that, sir?" He held out the shawl. His hands were steady, but the offering was not casual. It was the careful extension of something that mattered more than the gesture could contain. "Would you clean this? Not the way a preservation specialist would, not the way an archivist would, the way you clean things gently, with attention, without removing what is in the fabric. Just enough that I can hold it without feeling that it is falling apart in my hands." I took the shawl. It was lighter than I expected, Thyron silk, woven so tightly that the individual threads were invisible to the eye. The violet dye had faded unevenly, leaving a mottled landscape of deep purple and pale lavender that looked, in the skylight, like terrain seen from very high up, a country mapped in color and absence. And the scent, warm stone after rain, faint and fading and stubborn, rose from the fabric and filled the space between us with 11 years of absence made briefly, tenderly present. "I can do that," I said. I left the library carrying the shawl folded over my forearm, walking the East Wing corridor with the care of someone transporting something irreplaceable. The other cleaning staff I passed in the West Wing junction, 2 Thyron women and a Drelathi man pushing a supply cart, glanced at the fabric and looked away. To them, it was a piece of old cloth. They could not smell what it carried, or if they could, they did not know what it meant. That was the nature of the gap between seeing a thing and understanding it. In the service wing's laundry section, the automated fabric processors hummed in their alcoves, large, efficient, impersonal machines designed to handle the Citadel's daily volume of bedding, uniforms, and drapery. I walked past them. I did not use the automated fabric processors, too harsh, too hot, too indiscriminate. A machine would have cleaned the silk and stripped the scent in the same efficient cycle, and the scent was the point. It was the whole point. I filled a basin with lukewarm water, not hot, because hot water strips fragrance-bearing oils from natural fiber, and added a quarter measure of the mildest cleanser I had, a compound I mixed for delicate synthetics that dissolved surface contamination without touching the oils that held scent in the weave. I had learned to mix this compound at a diplomatic residence on Kale Station, where the departing ambassador's spouse had left behind a curtain set made of tesserin moth silk that the new occupants wanted cleaned but not altered. The compound worked then. It would work now. I submerged the shawl and worked it gently with my fingers, watching the water cloud with 11 years of accumulated dust while the fabric beneath emerged, not restored to new, because nothing can be restored to new but cleaned, tended, given the attention that says, "You are worth the effort of careful hands." I rinsed it 3 times in cool water. I pressed the excess moisture out between clean towels, never wringing, because Thyron silk tears when twisted. I hung it in the service wing's drying alcove, where the ambient temperature was warm and constant, and the air moved just enough to carry moisture away without stressing the weave. 4 hours to dry. When I took it down, the violet had brightened, not to its original deep purple, but to a warm, honest lavender that carried its age with dignity instead of apology. And the scent remained. Fainter, yes, but present. Warm stone after rain. The ghost of a woman who had loved books and pressed flowers between their pages and sat in a library reading with her knees drawn up while the skylight painted her hair with light. I folded the shawl and returned it to the library. The king was gone. I placed it on the reading seat, not on the armrest where I had found it, but on the seat itself, folded neatly, the way you leave something for someone you know will return. I maintained the library for the remaining 4 months of my posting. Every week the signs of life accumulated, small and steady, like a garden coming back after a hard winter. More books pulled from shelves and placed on the table with light markers at the spines. The reading seat adjusted to a different angle, the king's preferred position, I eventually understood, subtly different from the one the consort had used, angled more toward the skylight and less toward the window, as if he was learning to inhabit the space as himself rather than as a visitor to her memory. The shawl moved. 1 week it was on the armrest. The next, draped over the chair's back, the casual position of a garment being used, not preserved. The week after that, I found it folded on the table beside the reading lenses, which had been moved down from the 3rd level and placed in the position of active use rather than memorial display. The cracked case was open. One morning I arrived to find a small crystal vase on the table, holding a fresh cutting from the garden, the same species as the pressed flower between the book's pages, but alive, its pale petals carrying the faint luminescence that Thyron flora showed in ambient light. The stem was cut at an angle, the way a gardener cuts when they want the flower to drink, not just to look at. He had brought living flowers into a room he had sealed to preserve the dead ones. That was the moment I knew the library had turned. I saw the king 3 more times during my posting. Brief encounters, each one a different texture of silence. The first was on the spiral walkway, he ascending as I descended, and we passed on the curve with a nod that carried more than any formal greeting could have. His eyes were clear. The shawl was not in his hands. He was carrying a book. The second was in the alcove itself, where he was reading and I was cleaning the perimeter shelves on the far side of the ground floor. We occupied the same room in a companionable silence that needed no explanation and received none. I cleaned. He read. At one point, without looking up from his book, he said, "The 3rd level walkway railing. You tightened it." "It was loose, sir. Safety concern." "It has been loose for 6 years. Velsha submitted 3 maintenance requests. None were actioned. The bolt just needed a quarter turn. It took about 10 seconds." He turned a page. 10 seconds, he said to himself or to the room, and then he read and I cleaned and the room held us both and the room was enough. The third was on my final day, when he was waiting for me. He stood by the reading table with his hands clasped behind his back, the formal posture of a Thyran monarch, tall and still and self-possessed. He wore court attire this time, a long silver-blue coat with crystal thread embroidery at the collar and cuffs, his white hair braided in the ceremonial style and fastened with crystal clasps that caught the skylight and scattered it in small arcs across the table. He looked like what he was, a king, and the contrast between this figure and the grieving man in the simple dark robe was so sharp that I almost did not recognize him. Almost, but his eyes were the same, silver-white, luminous, and carrying the weight of a man who has learned something about himself that he cannot unlearn and would not want to. "Your contract ends today," he said. "Yes, sir." "Where will you be posted next?" "I have not received my assignment yet. The rotation office notifies within a standard week of contract end." He reached into the inner fold of his coat and produced a small crystal case, the formal kind, the kind Thyran used for documents that carried weight. He held it out. "This is a letter of commendation from the Crown. It names your work in the East Wing Library and describes the nature and quality of the service you provided. It does not describe the personal conversations we have had. Those are private and will remain so. It describes the material restoration, the preservation treatment, the light panel repairs, the cleaning methodology, and the professional standard of care you brought to a space that had been declared non-completable by 2 previous assignments." He paused. "It is addressed to whatever institution or household receives you next." I took the case. It was warm from his hand. The crystal was smooth, heavier than it looked, with a small royal seal embossed on the lid. The mark that meant this was not a form letter but a personal communication from the monarch's own desk. "You could order me to stay," I said, "not as a challenge, not as an invitation, as an observation. Kings had that authority in the Atharan system. Employment contracts contained a royal retention clause that allowed the monarch to extend any posting indefinitely." "I could," he agreed. His expression shifted not to disagreement, but to something more considered, the look of a man who has thought carefully about a thing and arrived at a conclusion that costs him something. "I will not. You told me that your work requires movement, that you enter rooms without history, and that the absence of history is what allows you to see clearly. I believe you. If I retained you, you would become part of the household. The household's assumptions would eventually replace your clarity with familiarity, and the quality that made your work exceptional would erode into routine. I have seen that happen to every good person this citadel has absorbed. It would happen to you, and the rooms you have not yet entered, the rooms that need you next, would go uncleaned." He paused. The library's skylight cast its even, luminous light across his features, and in that light he looked not healed, not younger, but present, fully occupying the room in a way the grieving man in the dark robe had not been. He was standing in his dead wife's library with his eyes open, and the library was clean, and the books were stable, and the shawl was draped over the reading seat with the careless ease of a garment being used, and the pressed flower lay between pages nobody had closed, because the maid had understood that some things should never be closed, and a crystal vase held a living flower beside the pages that held a dead one. "You did not fix me, Bryn Calloway. I want you to know that. 11 years of grief does not resolve because a woman cleaned a room. No, sir, it does not. But you made it possible for me to sit in this chair, and from this chair, with her books and her shawl and the garden she planted visible through the window, from here I can do the rest myself. You did not carry me across, you swept the path." Swept the path. I had never thought of it that way, but the image was precise, not carrying, not pushing, not pulling, sweeping, clearing the debris so the person behind you can walk through. That was cleaning. That had always been cleaning. I held the crystal case in both hands. It was the first commendation I had ever received. 20 years of professional service across 6 postings, hospitals, outposts, diplomatic residences, frontier stations, and nobody had ever written down that I had done my job well. Not because I had not done it well, because the job by its nature is invisible. You notice a dirty floor, you do not notice a clean one. You notice when the lights fail, you do not notice when they work. The entire profession exists in the negative space of attention, the space where, if you do everything right, nobody sees you at all. "Thank you, sir," I said. And I meant it the way his commendation meant it, not as ceremony, not as obligation, but as the simple acknowledgement between two people who had shared a room and understood each other across every difference that should have prevented understanding. He inclined his head, the formal Theron gesture, but softened, the rigid protocol of a monarch bending just slightly toward something more human. Something learned, perhaps, from 5 weeks of watching a maid clean around a dead woman's shawl, with the hands of a person who understood that care is what you do when nobody is watching and nobody will ever know. I left the library. I walked down the East Wing corridor, past the repaired light panels and the polished floors and the door that would not be sealed again, because the room behind it had been made survivable by someone who understood that survivable was enough. I returned to the service wing, packed my bag, and reported to the head of household for departure processing. Overseer Velsha scanned my exit form with the administrative efficiency of someone closing a routine file. She noted the completion of primary and supplementary assignments and paused, her silver eyes narrowing, at the line item for the East Wing Library. "Status restored to functional condition," she read aloud, her gaze lifted to mine. The previous 2 cleaners listed this assignment as non-completable. It was completable. What was different? I considered the question. The honest answer involved a king's grief, a dead woman's shawl, a pressed flower, river stones in a dish, and the particular kind of attention that lets you see a room as it is rather than as you expect it to be. The professional answer was simpler and true in a different way. I read the room before I cleaned it. Velsha studied me for a moment, the longest she had ever looked at me outside of task assignment. Her luminous silver eyes held that particular Theron stillness that could mean anything: assessment, dismissal, respect, or the private recalculation of a person's value in the household's internal hierarchy. She had processed hundreds of contract workers through this citadel. She had seen them arrive with their bags and their tools and their quiet human endurance, and she had seen them leave, and she had never, in all that processing, received a commendation from the Crown regarding the performance of a cleaning staff member. The crystal case on her desk, the one I had shown her as part of the departure protocol, because commendations needed to be logged, was the first of its kind in her administrative career. I had seen her read it twice, her expression carefully neutral, before she set it aside and picked up my exit form. Then she stamped my exit form with the administrative seal, handed me my final pay chit, and said the only words she had spoken to me during my entire posting that were not instructions. "The East Wing has not been this well maintained since the consort was alive." I took my pay and my bag and walked out of the Atheran Royal Citadel into the wet autumn morning. A transport shuttle was waiting at the service entrance. Standard rotation, bound for the Regional Processing Center, where I would wait for my next assignment in a shared dormitory with other contract workers between postings, people whose work, like mine, was measured in rooms completed and rooms left behind. I climbed aboard, settled into a seat that smelled of recycled air and transit cleanser, and placed the crystal case in my lap. Through the transport's small window I could see the East Wing's upper level, the library's domed skylight catching the morning light and scattering it into the room below. I imagined the column of light falling across the reading alcove, across the open book and the pressed flower and the shawl draped over the chair, and the crystal vase holding a living flower beside the preserved one. I imagined the king entering the library this evening, sitting in his chair, opening a book. Reading in a room that smelled of clean crystal and warm stone after rain. The transport lifted. The citadel shrank below, becoming architecture, becoming geography, becoming one more posting in a career measured not in promotions or titles or commendations, but in rooms. The next posting would be another room, another space that someone had sealed or neglected or abandoned because nobody understood what it was holding. Another set of surfaces carrying the invisible weight of the people who had lived among them. I would enter it the way I always entered, with my bag and my tools, and the quiet attention of a person who has learned that the most important work is the work nobody sees. And that's seeing it, truly seeing it, even once, even briefly, even in the form of a crystal case that says I noticed what you did is enough. The transport climbed into the gray sky, carrying me toward whatever room was next. I held the case against my chest the way the king had held the shawl, with both hands, pressing it close, the way you hold evidence of something you were not sure was real until someone confirmed it. 20 years, 14 postings, thousands of rooms cleaned, hundreds of surfaces treated, dozens of spaces restored from conditions that other workers had declared non-completable, and one crystal case warm from a king's hand that said, I saw what you did. You mattered. I thought about the shawl, clean now, faded, its deep purple softened to honest lavender, still carrying the scent of warm stone after rain in the fibers that my careful hands had tended without stripping. Some things you cannot restore. You can only tend them. And tending, the slow, patient, invisible act of caring for what remains, is not less than restoration. It is more.